If you've been following the economy quite closely, then you'll probably realize that we are at an inflection point, where the system is so over-leveraged and about to implode, and the entire house of cards could come falling down. And we all know that when the financial system collapses, the consequences on the rest of humanity can be very severe. Now in this video, I want to be talking about CBDCs. Now for those of you who may not be familiar with the term CBDC, it's essentially central bank digital currencies. And I think it's a very important point in time to be talking about this, so that people understand what CBDCs really are and what they can be used for. Now, when we talk about CBDCs, it's important to layer on who is pushing the notion of CBDCs. If you followed my channel or you've been paying attention to what's going on, then you'll know that the WEF, or the World Economic Forum, as well as the IMF and all these government institutions are behind pushing CBDCs. And if you know what the WEF is up to, then you'll know that it has very nefarious intentions behind the whole CBDC concept. Now we need to take a step back and really understand what are these CBDCs, because I don't think the public will necessarily just accept CBDCs. They are going to bring it about through some sort of crisis, through the collapse of the current financial system. And that crisis will allow them an opportunity to bring forward the CBDCs and roll it out at a time when people are so fearful and full of anxiety that they will just buy into this narrative. Now, from what I understand and what I've read, what they will do is collapse the entire financial system through either some sort of cyber attack or through the implosion of the global economic system. And that will allow them an opportunity to come there and recover the system through offering individuals who have lost money in the bank an equivalent amount of money through these CBDCs. And this will allow people the opportunity to regain some of their wealth. Now, it might be sold as something with a very benign intentions, but not really, because you need to understand where they are going with the CBDCs, and all this is part of their planning. So let's go into what is CBDCs and how nefarious can it be. Now, central bank digital currencies are very different from Bitcoin and other crypto assets in that they are centralized, and essentially centralized such that they give all the power to your central banks. A centralized authority, everything that cryptocurrencies try to go against. Now, when you have centralized currencies, it essentially gets rid of CBDCs. They may initially introduce them with some sort of protection measures to assure you of your privacy and your ability to have the equivalent functionality of cash. But don't be fooled by this. If they have the power to use this to strip you of your rights of privacy, they will do that as soon as there's some sort of crisis to justify their intentions. Now, CBDCs can be really bad, and I'm going to go through just a few of circumstances where CBDCs can be used in a very negative way. The first is CBDCs can be used to levy negative interest rates, and it can be individualized to certain individuals. And this can be linked to the whole social credit score system. So if they think you're behaving badly or really expressing your freedom of speech, they'll use this as a means of punishing you for speaking against the government, similar to what they have in China through their social credit score system. So it's something to really be mindful of. They will also have the ability to freeze your account, similar to what happened with the trucker convoy. When you don't have sovereignty over your money and it belongs to the central banks, you don't really control your money, and it's easy for them to just freeze your money. Now, CBDCs also give them the ability to control how you spend your money. If they feel you should not be spending your money on certain items, they can simply freeze your account or restrict your ability to purchase certain items from certain stores. And in that way, they can incentivize what would be beneficial to them rather than the greater good of the public. Now, this is scary because you work hard for your money and you should be able to spend it the way you see fit, irrespective of what the government thinks is beneficial to you. Now, CBDCs can also be really bad in that it can have expiry dates on your money. If they feel like the system needs more cash to circulate around, or if they need to draw out more of the money from the public, they can use expiry dates to force you to spend the money, and if you don't spend it, it will recirculate to the government coffers. Now, that is a very scary proposition, and it disincentivizes savings, because if you have savings in the form of CBDCs, then that is a very scary proposition. And also note that they will be bringing out this whole thing of you will own nothing and be happy. So it's not like they will even afford you the opportunity to invest in something else. So they are disincentivizing savings and essentially obliterating the middle class so that everyone is at the subservient level towards the governments and the elites of the world. So now let's get into this whole green initiative, because it all fits together with the CBDCs and being able to infuse within CBDCs this carbon limit, meaning each individual will only be able to spend up to a certain carbon limit, and in that way restrict people from being able to purchase certain things because of their carbon footprint. Essentially, it's trying to push people into a very miserable situation where they can control what you do with your money and limit your lifestyle and standards of living. Now you may be thinking, oh, the world is coming to an end, and it's really important for people to decrease their carbon footprint. Now, I'm not arguing that people can generally behave better and that there's a need to behave more responsibly towards the environment. But people need to understand what is going on around here, around this whole green initiative, because it is being weaponized to stifle the middle class, and it's being used as a control mechanism to essentially eliminate the middle class and bring them to the levels where there's only one subservient class and the global elites. Now, you need to recognize that the whole climate change narrative, there's a lot of false information that they're trying to push onto us, to think that there's a great concern about our carbon footprint and how there's a need to reduce the populations so that the world can sustain itself. I can tell you that from the research that I've done, this is not true, and it's being weaponized as a means to instill fear in people so that people are so concerned about the future of humanity, of their children, if they don't limit their carbon footprint. But you need to recognize that this is being done with a very nefarious intention, and it's because the global elites want to concentrate that power within them, that they are using this as a mechanism to try and push the people out of their good nature to buy into this narrative. And I think people need to wake up and realize that this is being done with very nefarious intentions. Intentions to stifle your quality of living, and really is going to make the quality of life of your kids and future generations very miserable if we continue on this path forward, because it's going to be a very tyrannical structure, and the quality of people's lives are going to be significantly infringed upon. Now, you may be thinking, oh, but I need to do some sort of good. Well, think about not having a stable power source or electricity. Think about how your life is going to be impacted because of buying into this global carbon narrative or this green initiative that is being thrust upon you, because there aren't viable alternative sources that have been fully developed to be able to allow for a smooth transition to green sources. What is being done is going to be very abrupt in terms of transitioning us from a fossil fuel basis to this green initiative. And that is going to have very dire consequences on people, on the food supplies, and the ripple effect to everything else. Okay, so I've also included a video or a segment of the Corona Investigative Committee hearings by Dr. Rainer Fulmich, and his interviewee in this episode was Harley Schlenger, and he gave a really great background on the economic state, as well as how we ended up to the current point in time. And this is really important because it's going to provide that context and background behind where and how CBDCs fit into this whole narrative, and why it's being pushed so hard by the WEF and the global elites to have society move on to this CBDC system. So hopefully this will help to provide some context and allow you to connect the dots. Now, it is a fairly lengthy video, but I think it's going to provide a very credible sources of information or alternative source of information from what you hear on the mainstream, because you're not going to hear this on the mainstream media, because a lot of this information is being censored and you can't rely on mainstream media for any credible or truthful news out there. They are trying to sell a narrative and to keep people in this constant state of fear and anxiety, and you need to get off the mainstream media if you need to find out the truth and to understand what is really taking place. They have lost all their credibility and they have really discredited humanity during this time. It's about time that people recognize this and take a stand and start switching off the mainstream media and moving onto these alternative platforms to try and understand what is the truth. Dr. Rainer Fulmich does a fantastic job with his Corona Investigative Committee hearings to bring out a lot of the truth and what has really transpired during the scamdemic. So hopefully you enjoy these videos, and please remember to spread this message and to help others understand what is really going on, because it's important for humanity to realize where we are at and that there needs to be a great awakening. People need to realize what is transpiring and not just rely on the mainstream narrative that is being pushed down their throats.
In the United States, he's the spokesman for the LaRouche organization, and he's going to take a closer look at Russia's military operations in Ukraine. And maybe it was just a pretext to launch pre-planned financial economic warfare against a leading opponent to the unipolar order. It could have been planned for months. A leading U.S. senior official admitted by March 1st. National security and sovereignty is unacceptable to those who demand that all nations submit to their Great Reset, naturally. They are now resorting to psychological warfare and censorship to blind the people to the danger humanity faces if there's no move to a new security and financial architecture. Provocative thesis, Mr. Schlenger. What do you think? What do you say to this?
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Great to have you with us. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you for the invitation. And as I understand it, my role here is to present somewhat of the what my colleagues and I call the big picture,
Yes.
which is behind the tumult and turbulence in the world today, including the inflation, including the push for the Great Reset, the Green New Deal, and the use of the Ukraine situation to bring to heel two of the leading opponents of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. Now, very few people have a sense of this picture because the history of the recent era has been told by the people who are responsible for these calamities. And what we've done and what I've devoted my last 40 years of my life to is uncovering who is running these policies, the globalization policies, the merger, you might say, the marriage between British imperial geopolitics and neoliberalism, and what effect that has on the ability of citizens to actually carry out policy as opposed to submitting meekly to the imposition from above. Now, I think the battle today has to be seen in the context of 400 or 500 years or even longer of history as a battle between advocates of Republican institutions, that is, institutions of self-government, as opposed to an oligarchy which rules from the top down for the benefit of the few. One of the great events in human history was the American Revolution, which followed in the footsteps of such previous movements as the Renaissance, the establishment of the modern nation state, the principle of Westphalia, which basically said that every nation must act in the interest of the other, and the drafting of the American Constitution, which created for the first time an institutional commitment to the idea of the general welfare of the population. That is, that the people have the responsibility to determine policy. Now, that's what the fight is about today. Who makes the policy? And I want to give a brief historical background to what's happened since probably the beginning of the 20th century. And I mean brief, but to hit some of the highlights to give people a sense of where we are today, because none of this is available to you in the universities or certainly not in the media, in the discussions among heads of state, certainly not in the Congress, which is a ship of fools, in my opinion. So we've been engaged in this, the LaRouche organization, for 40, 50 years, since the late 60s, when Mr. LaRouche identified the emergence of what we call today the green movement, or environmentalism, as an attack on science and on the idea of technological progress. And underlying it was what we identify as a Malthusian outlook. And by Malthusian, I'm sure many of you people listening know, we're talking about the British philosopher economist who was basically a paid hitman for the British East India Company, who argued that population growth will outstrip the resources to keep people alive, and therefore you have to reduce population to enable the few to have a better life. Now, we've seen this reemerge over and over and over, especially in the period in the 20th century with the eugenics movement and so on. So let me just give you a brief history from our perspective, which I think is highly relevant for the work that you're doing. Now, you start with the end of the 19th century and the creation in the British Empire of this idea of geopolitics, which was essentially that for the British Empire to sustain its control of trade and finances, you could never allow an alliance between Eurasian countries and European countries. In particular, they were threatened by the idea of the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad and the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States as a model for the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The idea of France, Germany, and Russia being unified was a direct threat to the control of the British of trade and finance using the ocean, using sea power as the basis of its power. And in 1904, a man named Mackinder delivered a speech, The Geographical Pivot of History, which laid this out and became the policy of the British Empire to pit France and Russia against Germany, and which was committed to bringing the United States in on the side of France and Russia, and of course the United Kingdom, against Germany. And that was the basis of World War I. Now, in the interwar years, you had policy defined by the Treaty of Versailles, which essentially punished Germany, but more importantly, represented the triumph of what I would call corporatist ideology. And there's a specific term that was used in identifying this at that time, which was called synarchy, S-Y-N-A-R-C-Y. Very few people today know this term. It's been written out of history. But if you go back through the records of the intelligence community that was emerging during the Franklin Roosevelt administration, they use this term to describe the use of left and right wing, supposedly opposition, but nevertheless to divide the population in such a way that the corporate cartels could rule without fear of interruption. It was largely centered at 120 Broadway in the United States. It included the Wall Street banks, the London banks, names such as Harriman, Rockefeller, Morgan, DuPont. And these were people who essentially in the interwar period established the trusts with the Germans, which ultimately put Hitler in power and which carried out the eugenics experiments, which were so dear to these networks. Before the Nazi experiments with eugenics, in fact, before the Nazis came to power, the Center of Eugenics Research was done in the United States, funded especially by the Rockefeller and Harriman interests. And one of the associates of the Harrimans was a man named Prescott Bush, who later became a senator from Connecticut, the father of one president and the grandfather of another. And it was the Harriman Bush Bank, the Union Bank of New York, which provided funds through Fritz Thyssen that helped Hitler come to power. So this is not just a conspiracy theory. There are documents which now are being hidden, by the way, in the National Archives, which showed that in 1942, after the United States entered the war, the Harriman Bush Bank was seized under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And those are documents which you can no longer find. Associates of mine, a historian named Anton Chaikin, uncovered them about a decade ago, and they're now available for people to look at. Now, what's the importance of this? Well, the policy of extermination that took place in Germany was not a German idea. It was an idea introduced by this oligarchy, going back to people such as the use of Darwin. And one of the key families in this is the Huxley family. Julian Huxley, in particular, who was involved in setting up UNESCO at the end of World War II, who had an idea that eugenics could be useful for purifying the race, but it was given a bad name by the Nazis. And so he carried out an effort to reform the idea of eugenics so it could be useful in the post-war period. And it was out of this that the emergence of the environmentalist movement in the end of the 50s, funded largely by very wealthy philanthropists like Lawrence Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller III. In Europe, it was the Club of Rome under Aurelio Peccei. It was the research done at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology by Meadows and Forrester, who proclaimed there are limits to growth. And the whole idea was to use the student movement in the late 60s and early 70s as a marcher force to impose these anti-science, anti-technology policies to reduce the population. Now, why go through this background? Well, if you look at what also was going on in that period, in 1971, because of the dollar crisis, which was provoked by the British, it actually started with the pound crisis in 1968, the dollar crisis was used as an excuse to take the dollar off the gold standard as a gold reserve and to set up the floating exchange rate, which was used by people like George Soros and speculators to create a whole new economy against the idea of an economy of physical production in favor of an idea of bubbles and speculation. That has gone increasingly bad over the last 50 years. We had a series of bubbles and pops of those bubbles, the 1987 stock market crash, the 1997 Asian market crash, the 98 Russian bond crash, the 2000 dot-com bubble crash, the 2007, 2008 crash, and so on, to the point that today we're facing another global financial crisis. Now, if you put together the attempt to use geopolitics to divide countries, to use identity politics to divide people within countries against each other, and the neoliberal policy, which says you can't trust government, everything must be done on an individual basis, free the individual from regulation. What you've created is a perfect storm for the crises we face today. Now, just in terms of this merger of neoliberalism and geopolitics, let me refer to a couple of events that are sort of examples of this kind of merger. First, you had at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, in August 2019, a conference presided over by the Federal Reserve. It's their annual retreat. But at this conference, they had Larry Fink from BlackRock, they had Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, Sir Michael Bloomberg, and a number of others who presented an idea which they called the financial regime change. This is where they first put forward in concrete terms what they meant by the Great Reset. And the idea was that you cannot trust governments under conditions of crisis because they'll want to spend money to alleviate the problems. But that's not allowable under the neoliberal system. Instead, the only purpose of governments creating money, or rather private banks creating money, is to bail out the speculators. And so the attempt was made at this Jackson Hole, Wyoming, to popularize the idea of technocrats taking over the economy from governments. And explicitly what they said is that representative governments tend to be responsive to the needs of constituents, but that can't be allowed anymore. And so the Great Reset is where the central banks of the world control not only the credit and currency policy, but the spending policy. You take it out of the hands of the people entirely. And that's the idea behind the Great Reset, which we call a global central bankers dictatorship. Only remember, central bankers are not governments. They essentially act at the interest of private banks, the largest private banks, as we saw in 2008 when the crash came and they bailed out the speculators and sent 7 million families out of their homes. Now, I just want to read a couple of quotes from an event that took place to push this in November 9th through 11th, 2020, called the Green Horizon Financial Summit, because what was decided was the Great Reset would be used primarily to push through the green agenda, which is getting rid of energy, efficient energy production, nuclear, coal, gas, and so on, and put the whole world reliant on inefficient and unsustainable forms of wind and solar power. Now, at this meeting, the Green Horizon Summit, it took place in the City of London, funded by the City of London Corporation, the World Economic Forum, which is the Davos Group, and something called the Green Finance Institute, which is funded by the City of London and the British Treasury. Among the people there were Mark Carney, BlackRock, the Bank of England, Michael Bloomberg, Bill Gates, and Prince Charles. And I want to call your attention to the comments made by Prince Charles there, because whether people know it or not, Prince Charles has been one of the key people in imposing this green policy from the beginning. Now, the message of this whole summit was that you have to use finances to make the transition from efficient energy production to the so-called green policy. And so they would withhold credit and tax producers and instead generously subsidize the more inefficient forms of energy, the wind energy, plant-based diets, and things of that sort. Now, here's what Prince Charles said, and this gets right to the point. He was a speaker at this. And what he said is that we have to use the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to transition to a zero carbon emission policy. He said the current pandemic has brought unimaginable devastation to people's lives, livelihoods, and national economies. At the same time, the green recovery represents an unprecedented opportunity to rethink and reset the ways in which we live and do business. If this is reminiscent of what you've heard from Klaus Schwab, it's no coincidence, because Prince Charles is one of the closest collaborators of Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum. Prince Charles went on to say, I have long believed we need a shift in our economic mode that places nature and the world's transition to net zero emissions at the heart of how we operate, prioritizing the pursuit of the sustainable in the decades to come. Now, he unveiled a plan called his Marshall Plan. And essentially, it was to set up something which they call the Financial Initiative for Net Zero. And the idea is that they will establish policing mechanisms so that any banks which loan money for energy firms, such as discovery of new areas for drilling or nuclear energy, coal, things of that sort, will be cut off from credit. And only those firms with zero emissions, including corporate firms and manufacturing, only those with zero emission will be given credit. So that it was an effort that included 140 banks to cut credit to the productive sector and instead channel everything into the green technologies. And the green technologies cannot support a world population of 7+ billion people. And we've seen that when it's broken down from time to time. We see that in terms of what's happening in the developing sector, but it can support a new financial bubble. And what was put forward by Carney and Prince Charles is that if you bring together private equity, the hedge funds and so on, with funds generated by governments, you could create a $40 trillion fund to go into this. And this would include the carbon trading, bonds issued based on reduction of energy production and so on. So it was an attempt to impose by the power of this supranational force, not by governments, but governments operating under a supranational force that would be imposing these policies on nations. Now, they presented this at the COP26 or the FLOP26 conference in Glasgow, and the developing sector rejected it. The head of the African Union, the president of Senegal, said, well, it sounds all well and good, but we have 600 million people who don't have electricity in Africa and need electricity. Well, Ursula von der Leyen just told them recently, that's tough. We're going to put solar panels in your deserts, and basically the new colonialism will be to steal your solar rays to produce electricity in Europe. This is a new form of colonialism, which, not surprisingly, Prince Charles is one of the leading proponents of this. Now, I'm sure you know very well Klaus Schwab's view on this thing. Yeah. You know, his basic idea is that you have to use the pandemic as a way of enforcing changes. That is, his goal is to impose these changes of the Green New Deal and the Great Reset. And he sort of sums this up in a section in his 2021 book, Stakeholder Capitalism, where he writes that he's talking about Ethiopia, which wants to develop, and it wants railroads, agricultural improvement, the Grand Renaissance Dam. And he's very unhappy that China is financing some of this. But he goes on to say that that kind of development being undertaken reveals the central conundrum of the combat against climate change. Now, this is Schwab. The same force that helps people escape from poverty and lead a decent life is the one that is destroying the livability of our planet for future generations. The emissions that lead to climate change are not just the result of a selfish generation of industrialists or Western baby boomers. They are the consequence of the desire to create a better future for oneself. That's what the Great Reset is about. Your selfishness, wanting to have heat in the winter, if you live in a climate that needs it, air conditioning in the summer, an automobile, an adequate food supply, that selfishness is what's boiling over the planet. And that's what you get from whether it's Greta Thunberg or Barack Obama lecturing South African students in 2014 when they told him they want an American style of living. And Obama said to them, it's not possible. If you get that, the planet will boil over. Now, how do they impose this? You can use cutting off credit. And we're watching now how they're using the cutoff of credit and cutting off access to the modern financial system to try to punish Russia. This has been in the works going back to at least 2015, 2016. It was somewhat set back by the election of Donald Trump in the United States because Trump was not a globalist. I think, unfortunately, he didn't do what he said he was going to do, but he was opposed to many of these schemes. What we're seeing now is a merger of the Great Reset, the Green New Deal, the policies on COVID, and a number of other aspects of government policy, which is being directed not on behalf of sovereign governments, but against sovereign governments. And this is why we're seeing the situation in Ukraine. I know this is a long prologue to get to Ukraine, but this is what you have to understand. What is Russia's crime? Putin has asked for 20 years for security guarantees for Russia. And these guarantees include no further eastward expansion of NATO, which was promised to Gorbachev in 1990, which was promised again to Yeltsin in 1994. And yet NATO keeps moving to the very borders of Russia. Now they're talking about, as Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, did at the Munich Security Conference, that Ukraine has a right to develop nuclear weapons. And for Putin, Russia's security is directly threatened by two aspects of the Ukraine situation. The corruption, which includes prominent Nazis in positions of the defense and security forces of Ukraine. And if you're interested, I can give you chapter and verse on that, which is, you're not allowed to say that in the West. The European Union actually acknowledged in 2018 that the defense and security forces of Ukraine were heavily infiltrated by neo-Nazis, marching behind the banners of the Ukrainian SS, which joined Hitler in the 1940s. But you're not allowed to say that anymore. And when Putin said you need a denazification of Ukraine, he was called crazy. But the idea of a government, a corrupt government, being used not to defend the Ukrainian people's freedom and sovereignty. And I hate to see what's being done to the people of Ukraine right now in this war. But they are the cannon fodder for a NATO and US and British drive to bring down Russia and China. Why? Because they're the two leading powers in the world that oppose giving up sovereignty to this Green New Deal and the Great Reset. And other countries, such as India, are backing them up. There were 34 nations that abstained from the UN General Assembly vote to condemn Russia. They include more than half the population in the world. And the reason they oppose it is this question of development. And these are countries which have never been allowed to develop modern healthcare systems. I want to come back to one final point that I think is relevant in this consideration, which is that when you look at the COVID situation and go to the big picture, it was clear whether this was a bioengineered project or not. I'm not capable of judging that. But what was clear going back to 30 years ago is that we were tearing down the public health system of most advanced sector nations, especially the United States. And why were we doing this? Privatization. And who benefits from privatization? The cartels, whether it's the pharmaceutical cartels, the for-profit hospitals, the insurance cartels, the banks. They don't want to spend money on public health because at heart, many of them are committed to the principles of eugenics. So when you look at the crisis as a whole from the top, what we're facing is a drive of this financial empire to save itself because it's sitting on top of trillions of dollars of unsustainable debt, third world debt, government debt, corporate debt, private sector debt, credit card debt, student debt. This is never going to be repaid, but they figure they can use the flows of funds from the Federal Reserve and the central banks to sustain the false paper values while destroying the living standards of the population. And that includes destroying the healthcare system. And doing it for what reason? Stakeholder capitalism, profit, the profit motive for the oligarchs. And so I think that is the picture I wanted to present on this an overview, the big picture, so-called. And just to come back to one point, the people who are considered the enemies of this system, besides Russia and China, are the ordinary citizens in countries such as Germany, France, Italy, the United States, people who don't trust their governments. This is the other aspect that's become really clear in the COVID situation. People don't trust governments anymore, and there are reasons for that. And unless we change that, unless we have a transformation, and what the Schiller Institute is fighting for right now is convening an international convention to take up this question of a security architecture which protects the security of every nation, not just the wealthiest nations, but all sovereign nations and all peoples of nations. And along with that, a financial architecture that doesn't benefit just the few, but actually allows for a sustainable future of an improving standard of living for the whole world's population. And we have at theschillerinstitute.com a petition to that effect. And I'd ask people who are hearing this to check that out, to read it and sign it and circulate it if you're interested. So I thank you for the time you've given me. And I have a little bit of time here now to take some questions. So I'm at your disposal.
Mr. Schlanger, in view of what we've heard from investigative journalists, historians, and others, this makes absolute perfect sense to me. Your analysis hits it right on the spot, I believe. Basically, what your organization and others are asking for is what Franklin D. Roosevelt was trying to install in his idea of a cooperative New World Order, which would have made all of this impossible. But it is important for the people to understand what's going on here. That's why it's got to be exposed. Because as you said, people don't trust government anymore, and for a very good reason, because these governments are not our governments anymore. So this has nothing to do with black against whites, Russians against Americans, Chinese against green, white, or blue people. This is only us, all of us, against these oligarchs. Unless I'm completely mistaken.
No, I think that's exactly right. And the whole idea of, if you look at in the United States, what are called identity politics, it's to divide people against each other.
Yeah.
That someone else's benefit is at your expense. And therefore, you have to mobilize for your group, whether it's a sexual identity or religious or a racial identity or an ethnic identity. And the same thing is this is a model on the small of geopolitics in the large. The greatest threat to the British Empire going into the 20th century was the emergence of an anti-colonial force, which saw in its best interest education, science, and collaboration with the advanced sector. And instead, what they got were wars after World War II. I mean, just in the recent period, I can't believe the hypocrisy. I was just online with the Chatham House event a few minutes ago before this, where they were talking about an international tribunal to bring Putin to the dock. Now, I posed a question, which of course didn't get read. Where were these guys when the US and NATO were killing people in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya? Where was the outcry there? Where is the outcry when you see these policies that are driving up the price of energy so that there won't be enough fertilizer produced to produce food to take care of people who are hungry? Where's the outcry about the United States withholding funds from Afghanistan, where 20 million people, including 9 million children, face starvation? So the post-Cold War order, what they call the rules-based order, or what I call the unipolar order, this is in a desperate battle to preserve what they consider its rights. And one thing I think can be encouraging for people who are working with you and involved in this overall movement is that they're on the defensive. They know they don't have the support of the population. They can try to brainwash, they can try to manipulate, but when it really gets down to it, if there's a voice that expresses the opposition to this global order, people will respond. Just look at the United States, the improbable election of Donald Trump in 2016, mainly because he didn't want to go to war in Syria as Hillary Clinton was pushing. So I think we have to realize that this order is on its last legs, but it's very dangerous because they are run by lunatics and they have access to nuclear weapons. And they indicated very clearly that they're not going to allow Putin to present an argument, no matter how legitimate it is, to change this order. But it has to be changed.
So what this boils down to is that we have to continue to expose them, to get the truth out, the true facts out, and to keep them from continuing with their manipulation, which is a massive psychological operation, as many of our experts have explained to us, some of whom are former members of the British intelligence services. So we believe that we have really substantive and concrete evidence to show to the world, not just us, but all the other alternative media as well, that could change people's minds, because the way that people are thinking is only a result or a consequence of at least the last 30 years of manipulation going on in education, primarily, I would say. My wife is a teacher, and that's why she got out of there.
Well, let me give you an example of how this works, because there are two examples. The persecution of Julian Assange. What's Assange's crime? He exposed war crimes using the documents of the US Department of Defense and the CIA. Why are they killing him in a dungeon in Great Britain instead of treating him as a hero and putting the people who committed these war crimes on trial? And I can bring it to the personal level for me, the persecution of Lyndon LaRouche, who was put in prison for 5 years, charged with one-man conspiracy to defraud the Internal Revenue Service, because he had been a veritable fountain of ideas against this globalist empire, up to the point where in the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan brought LaRouche in to negotiate the Strategic Defense Initiative with the Soviet Union, the idea of getting out of a mutual and assured destruction nuclear crisis by sharing technologies that could eliminate the danger of nuclear weapons. That was when Henry Kissinger said, we have to get rid of LaRouche. The head of the Get LaRouche Task Force in 1987 was a man who's become very famous in the last few years named Robert Mueller. His first big case was the persecution of Lyndon LaRouche in the Boston trial in 1987. And by the way, Mueller's not a very good attorney. He lost that because the judge threw the case out on the basis of the government withholding documents. So truth is on our side. Justice is on our side. But you have to have the courage to fight. And these days, it means standing up against what generally is pushed as popular opinion by the mainstream media. But as you know, the mainstream media is also losing its credibility faster and faster. What we have to do is have, the reason I approach this thing from the so-called big picture is you've got to unify people not on the individual fights. And I certainly understand people who don't support masking and vaccine mandates and things of that sort. Sure, fight them, but go at the big picture. Yes. Who's pushing this and why? Who is the one or the network which is responsible for trying to carry out a global genocide in with the intention of a Malthusian purification of the human race? And by the way, if you consider Prince Charles an example of the purification of the human race, then that in itself ought to be an advertisement against what they stand for.
Can I ask you, like this whole, I mean, I think scheme with these certificates for like CO2, that's also like that's a big money making scheme. And I just recently read that there's they're creating like new pseudo assets like that you can now for like a country maybe can sort of put the value of what the mountain is worth, or like these kind of nature assets. I think they're creating a whole new scheme of like maybe to balance out this this financial disaster, because now they have some pseudo assets that they can present to the the unknowing public.
You're absolutely right about that. But if you look at what they've been doing since the 70s and 80s, when they took down the regulations that prevented this kind of speculation, which go back to Franklin Roosevelt, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which wouldn't allow commercial banks to engage in investment. You look at it now, there's $1 to $2 quadrillion worth of financial derivatives. And what's a financial derivative? That's what you're talking about now with the carbon assets. A financial derivative is something which has no inherent value in itself. It could just be a piece of paper or a notation on a computer, but is derived from something of value. And so think about it as leverage or margin, that you can go into deeper and deeper debt based on the fact that some sucker may pay more for this. And who are the suckers? The pension fund holders, the people who have no really ability to fight, who put money into Social Security, who put money into these hedge funds. And the hedge fund guys make all the money from these phony instruments. And this is called financial innovation. And it goes back especially to the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999, which Bill Clinton signed under the influence of Larry Summers and Robert Rubin, but was also supported by the neoliberals and the Republican Party. So they're now doing that using the green economy and so-called man-made global warming to induce people to allow this new bubble to be created. I mentioned it in my presentation, but Mark Carney said that by setting up a compact of the major banks and financial institutions only to lend for green technology, then you create a potential pool of $40 trillion. And on top of that, then you always have the capability to generate more funny money or fiat money through the central banking system. And what's the purpose of that? To keep the artificial value of these financial instruments on the books of banks, knowing that if they need it, they can always borrow more. And this actually became clear in September of 2019 with the so-called repo crisis in the United States, where the commercial banks could not put up enough money to cover corporate debt, and they had to bring the Federal Reserve in for a whole new realm of quantitative easing, which added up to $13 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2019 that went mostly to 6 banks, 4 U.S. banks and 2 foreign banks. That's how insane, and you're absolutely right in bringing that up. It's the green financial bubble.
And hasn't been Al Gore involved in this, like this whole carbon market? And so he would have like a conflict of interest, basically, like by pushing this an Inconvenient Truth movie. And then it's maybe in, I don't know if at that point, like the assets were already like created, but like at least he was preparing for that.
You know, I wrote an article in 2004 called From Hippies to Hedge Funds, which talked about how this Silicon Valley operation, which is now, besides Wall Street and the City of London, the other big source of funds and funny money, that the people who funded Al Gore's movie came from that network. And again, this is a swindle, but it was a swindle that was legitimized in 2008 when Barack Obama refused to prosecute the bankers who ran the mortgage-backed securities fraud. They got off in Great Britain. Millions of people lost their homes, and nothing happened to the swindlers. Actually, something did happen. They got the money. They not only were able to take the houses away, but they got the money from the banks to be able to market them and sell them and turn them into rental properties for people who can no longer afford to buy homes.
Mr. Schlanger, how big is this financial derivatives bubble? It's trillions, but I forget what the correct figure is. I think you said, well,
the actual figure of derivatives that are being held is hard to pin down, but somewhere between 300 and 600 trillion. Mm-hmm. But the trading on a daily basis is between $1 and $2 quadrillion that exchange hands, circulating back and forth these pieces of paper, which are worthless, but which the traders make money every time a trade is made.
We know that there are several banks out there, including my former employer, Deutsche Bank, which holds truckloads of these completely worthless commercial paper or derivatives. If one of them collapses, it's going to be like a whole house of cards. Their entire financial mafia is going to collapse because it's going to work like a domino. The first domino will work so that all the others will eventually come down. And
that's what happened in 2008, where they initially let Lehman go. Yeah. And then the head of Lehman made this comment as they were saying, we're going to let you go. He said, so now I'm the schmuck, because he knew that every other bank would be next. Now, if you, again, look at this, there are 6 or 8 banks that are at the heart of the repo, the trillions of dollars that have gone out since the end of 2019 to refinance these markets. At the heart of it is JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Nomura, and Deutsche Bank are the ones that have gotten the bulk of that. Now, the irony is that this is money created or funds volume of financial instruments created by the New York Fed. The New York Fed is owned by some of these banks, especially Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, and Bank of America. So they're getting the central bank to give them money to back up their worthless investments. And meanwhile, ultimately, when it collapses, it's going to be on the back of the taxpayers. Now, what they're trying to do is to build a new bubble with the Green New Deal, and at the same time, move toward an austerity policy for the population. And this is what LaRouche used to call Schachtian economics, because the person who first did this was Hjalmar Schacht, who was Hitler's finance minister. He was the one brought in to tame the Weimar hyperinflation in 23 in Germany. And then Schacht became the financial wizard behind the Nazi rearmament, who was backed by Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England, and the Bush-Harriman interests in the United States. And they rearmed Germany to turn them against the Soviet Union. And Hitler somewhat crossed them up by going west first.
And then there's also this problem with the Kreditausfallwirtschaft.
Credit default swaps.
That's another, I think,
Absolutely.
another giant topic that's not even in the focus of people. How do you think that plays into the whole picture?
Well, as I said, we're in a potential tsunami of debt defaults. And what Dr. Fulmick was saying is absolutely right. You have a chain reaction, and they don't know how to stop it. But they figure if you can keep people distracted with the war in Ukraine, keep people distracted by melting icebergs and the poor polar bears who are losing their habitat, which, by the way, is a fraud. If you can keep doing that, then maybe all these people will die and won't be able to fight. And we have to pull together a movement based on this idea of a new security architecture based on the principle of the Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War in 1648, which is that ultimately no country can have security without working to have security for your neighbors. And that's what Putin said to NATO. That's what he said to Biden. And as he said, they didn't listen. Now, I hate to do this, but I have another appointment I'm going to have to jump off.
That's all right, Mr. Schlanger. Someone's going to hold the back eventually. It's not going to be us. It's going to be them. That's what we're going to have to work for.
Well, as I've said, there should be no bailouts, no bail-ins, and no bail for the speculators.
No, they're all going to go to hell. Thank you very much, Mr. Schlanger. This was very, very, very informative. It backs up everything that we've learned over the course of the last 2 years, and that's why I think it is absolutely plausible. I'm convinced that your analysis is completely correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You took one of these because you were told to, and you wore one of these because you were told to. You endured lockdowns because you were told to. Didn't see family and friends because you were told not to. Even though our kids' mental health was going through the roof, but that didn't matter. That wasn't worth defending because we were told to do these things. Yeah? Over the past 2 years, our human rights have been stripped away from us. And we've ignored deaths from an experiment. But you didn't defend that because the media told you not to. The media told you those lives didn't matter. And now we've got adults virtue signalling the shit out of the Russia-Ukraine situation. And now you're all for love and peace and humanity and freedom. I stand with Ukraine. No, you don't. You don't stand for fucking anything. You didn't even defend your own freedoms and the freedoms of your children when we needed it the most.